The rain fell in sheets that night, turning the dirt paths into rivers of mud and making the world beyond Ilara's small cottage nearly invisible. She stood at her window, watching the storm rage across the valley, her thin shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders against the cold that seeped through every crack in the old wooden walls. This cottage, barely more than a shed, really, sat at the very edge of the Silver Moon Pack's territory, so far from the main compound that she could go days without seeing another soul. That isolation was both her punishment and her salvation. Ilara had been rejected by her own pack 3 years ago, cast out by an alpha who deemed her too weak, too soft, too fundamentally omega to deserve a place among them. The official reason given was that she had refused a mating with a beta warrior who wanted her. But the real reason ran deeper than that. She had dared to speak against the alpha's treatment of the elderly wolves in the pack, had suggested that perhaps strength wasn't only measured in how hard you could fight, or how completely you could dominate. For that audacity, she had been labeled a troublemaker, stripped of her pack connections, and sent to live in this forgotten corner of the territory where she survived on occasional cleaning work and the small vegetables she managed to grow in the rocky soil. The wind howled against the cottage, and Ilara was about to turn away from the window when she saw something that made her freeze. There, just at the edge of the tree line near her barn, was a dark shape crumpled on the ground. At first, she thought it might be a fallen branch, or perhaps a deer brought down by the storm, but then the shape moved slightly, and she realized with a jolt that it was a person. Someone was out there in the freezing rain, and from the way they lay motionless, they were either unconscious or very close to it. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed at her to stay inside, to lock her door, and pretend she had seen nothing. She was a lone omega with no pack protection, and anyone who ended up wounded and unconscious at the edge of pack territory was likely dangerous. They could be a rogue, or a criminal fleeing justice, or an enemy scout. If she helped them and the pack found out, she would be accused of harboring threats. If the stranger woke and meant her harm, there was no one close enough to hear her scream. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to ignore what she had seen and let nature take its course. But Ilara had never been good at doing the smart thing when someone was suffering. It was the very quality that had gotten her rejected in the first place. This stubborn compassion that she couldn't seem to suppress no matter how much safer it would make her life. She grabbed her lantern, threw on her waterproof cloak that was really just oiled canvas full of holes, and stepped out into the storm. The rain immediately soaked through her boots as she ran toward the moo. Fallen figure, the lantern swinging wildly in her hand and casting strange shadows across the muddy ground. Up close, she could see it was a man, large and powerfully built, even in his current state. His clothes were torn and soaked through with a mixture of rain and blood, and there were wounds across his chest and arms that looked like they had come from claws. A werewolf, then, attacked by his own kind. His face was turned away from her, half buried in the mud, and his breathing was so shallow. She had to lean close to confirm he was still alive. Ilara knew she couldn't move him on her own. He was easily twice her size and pure muscle, but she couldn't leave him in the rain either. The barn was closer than the cottage, and at least it would provide shelter from the worst of the storm. She grabbed him under the arms and began to drag him, her feet slipping in the mud and her muscles screaming with the effort. It took her nearly 20 minutes to move him the 30 feet to the barn door, and by the time she got him inside, she was gasping for breath, and her arms felt like they might fall off. The barn was dry at least, filled with the musty smell of old hay and the few chickens she kept for eggs. She dragged the stranger to the corner where she had a pile of relatively clean straw and managed to roll him onto his back. The lantern light revealed his face for the first time, and despite everything, despite the danger and the fear and the absolute insanity of what she was doing, Ilara felt her breath catch. He was beautiful in a harsh, dangerous way, with strong features and dark hair plastered to his forehead. There was something about him that radiated power even unconscious and wounded. Something that made her wolf whimper and want to bare her throat in submission. She shook off the reaction and focused on the practical matter of keeping him alive. The wounds across his chest were deep, the kind that would kill a human, but that a werewolf might survive if they were treated quickly. She ran back to the cottage and gathered what medical supplies she had, which wasn't much, just some clean cloth, a bottle of cheap whiskey she used for disinfecting, and a needle and thread she normally used to mend her clothes. Back in the barn, she cut away his shredded shirt and began to clean the wounds as best she could. The stranger didn't wake, even when she poured whiskey directly into the gashes, which worried her more than if he had screamed. She stitched the worst of the cuts closed with trembling fingers, her sewing skills barely adequate for the task, but better than leaving him to bleed out. His skin was cold to the touch, too cold, and she piled every blanket and tarp she could find on top of him to try to raise his body temperature. There was nothing more she could do except wait and hope that his werewolf healing would kick in once he was stable. For 3 days, Alara kept her vigil in the barn. She brought him water and tried to get him to drink, dribbling small amounts into his mouth and hoping he wouldn't choke. She changed his bandages and monitored his wounds for signs of infection. She talked to him sometimes, just a soft murmur of words about nothing important, because she had heard once that unconscious people could still hear, and it seemed cruel to leave him in complete silence. She neglected her cottage, her garden, everything except the chickens who wandered in and out of the barn, with confused clucks at finding a stranger in their space. On the 4th day, his fever finally broke. Alara was dozing in the corner, exhausted from nights of broken sleep, when she heard him stir. Her eyes flew open to find him looking at her with eyes that were a startling amber color, sharp and intelligent, and currently filled with confusion. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, her afraid to move in case he turned out to be dangerous after all, him clearly trying to figure out where he was and who she was. When he finally, spoke. His voice was rough from disuse, but held an undertone of authority that made her instinctively straighten. He asked where he was and how he had gotten there, and she explained haltingly about finding him in the storm and bringing him to the barn. She expected questions about her pack, or demands to know why she had helped him, but instead he just studied her face for a long moment, before thanking her in a way that sounded like he wasn't used to thanking anyone. Over the next week, the stranger who gave his name only as Kal slowly regained his strength. Alara brought him food from her meager supplies, soups made from vegetables and the occasional chicken when she could spare one, and he ate with an appetite that spoke of a body working hard to heal. He didn't talk much about himself or how he had ended up wounded at the edge of her territory, and she didn't push because she understood about needing to keep secrets. But they did talk, long conversations in the quiet of the barn while the world outside went about its business unaware of them. Kyle asked her about her life, and she found herself telling him things she had never told anyone, about the rejection and the isolation and the bone-deep loneliness of being cast out by your own kind. She told him about how she survived on the edges, doing work no one else wanted to do, always one bad winter or one angry pack member away from complete destitution. She expected pity or disgust, the usual reactions she got from wolves who learned she was rejected, but instead she saw something that looked like anger flash through his eyes. Anger that wasn't directed at her, but at the situation that had put her here. He told her a little about himself in return, carefully edited stories that she suspected left out more than they included. He spoke of politics and power struggles, of people who smiled to your face while planning your downfall, of the weight of responsibility, and the isolation that came from being unable to trust anyone around you. She noticed he never mentioned a pack by name or gave any details that might identify where he came from, and she respected that privacy even as she grew more certain that he was someone important, someone whose enemies had nearly succeeded in killing him. What neither of them talked about, what hung in the air between them like electricity before a storm, was the pull they both felt. Ilara had never experienced anything like it, this magnetic draw toward another, person that made her want to be close to him, to touch him, to bear all her secrets and trust him with everything vulnerable inside her. She caught him watching her sometimes with an intensity that should have frightened her, but instead made her feel seen in a way she never had been before. She told herself it meant nothing, that it was just proximity and the intimacy of caretaking creating false connection. But her wolf knew better and sang with recognition every time he was near. If you're Enjoying the story of an unexpected connection forming in the most unlikely circumstances? Please hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think Alara should do when she discovers who Kale really is. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the truth finally comes out. On the 8th day, Kale told her he had to leave. His wounds were healed enough that his werewolf constitution could handle the rest, and he had responsibilities that couldn't be ignored any longer. Alara felt something crack inside her chest at the words, but she just nodded and helped him gather what remained of his clothes. He stood at the barn door looking back at her, and she thought he might say something important, might explain the connection that hummed between them or promise to return. But instead, he just reached out and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear, in a gesture so tender it made her eyes sting. He told her that he owed her a debt he could never fully repay, that she had saved his life when she had no reason to risk her own safety. He told her she was stronger and braver than she knew, and that anyone who had rejected her was a fool who didn't deserve her. And then he made a promise that sounded almost like a vow, that he would come back for her, that this wasn't the end, but the beginning. She wanted to believe him, but she had learned long ago not to trust in promises, so she just smiled sadly and watched him disappear into the forest. The weeks after Kale left were the loneliest of Alara's life, which was saying something considering she had spent 3 years in isolation. She found herself looking toward the tree line constantly, hoping to see his tall figure emerging from the shadows. She replayed their conversations in her mind, analyzing every word and gesture for meaning. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that he had probably forgotten about her the moment he was back in whatever world he came from. But she couldn't quite make herself believe it. Then, 6 weeks after Kale had vanished back into the forest, everything changed. Alara was working in her small garden, trying to coax some late-season tomatoes into ripening, when she heard the sound of multiple wolves approaching. Her heart jumped into her throat, because lone omegas getting visited by groups was never a good thing. She stood slowly, dirt on her knees and hands, as 5 warriors in formal pack regalia emerged from the trees and walked directly toward her cottage. The lead warrior, a hard-faced beta woman with scars across her neck, looked at Alara with barely concealed disgust before announcing in a voice that carried across the clearing that all pack members and affiliated wolves were commanded to present themselves at the capital city of Thornwood in 3 days' time. The Alpha King himself had decreed a gathering of all packs, and attendance was not optional. Failure to appear would be considered an act of rebellion and dealt with accordingly. The warrior thrust a formal summons into Alara's hands, gave her one more dismissive look, and then the group turned and headed back the way they had come without waiting for any response. Alara stood frozen, staring at the ornate paper in her hands. The Alpha King, the ruler of all werewolf packs across the entire continent, the most powerful alpha in existence, was summoning everyone to the capital. Rumors had been swirling for months about this. Whispers that the king was finally going to choose a mate and needed to make a show of unity among the packs. The idea of going to Thornwood, of being in a city full of powerful wolves who would all see her as beneath them, made her stomach twist with anxiety. But the summons was clear. Refusal would mark her as a rebel and give her own pack the excuse they had always wanted to be rid of her permanently. The journey to Thornwood took 2 days by the pack transport, a bus that picked up wolves from all the outlying territories and ferried them to the capital. Alara sat in the back, ignored by everyone else except for a few sneers from wolves who recognized her as the rejected Omega from Silvermoon. She kept her head down and tried to make herself as small and invisible as possible, a skill she had perfected over the years. The other wolves talked excitedly about the gathering, speculating about which powerful alpha female the king would choose as his Luna, whether it would be Morgana Blackwood with her ancient bloodline or perhaps Seraphina Nightshade, whose pack controlled the wealthy southern territories. When they finally arrived in Thornwood, Alara was overwhelmed by the sheer size and grandeur of it all. She had never been to the capital before, had never even left her own territory, and the massive stone buildings and wide streets filled with important-looking wolves made her feel even smaller than usual. The pack members were herded to temporary housing, large dormitories separated by rank where they would stay until the gathering was complete. Alara ended up in a basement room with other low-ranking wolves, a space that was cold and damp, but at least had a bed. The next day was a chaos of preparation. All wolves attending the ceremony had to be properly dressed, and despite her protests, Ilara was measured and fitted for a formal gown like everyone else. The seamstress who handled her made it clear through every sniff and eye roll that she considered it a waste of good fabric to dress an Omega reject. But orders were orders. The dress they gave her was simple compared to what the higher-ranking wolves received, but it was still the nicest thing Ilara had ever worn, a deep forest green that brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. The ceremony was to be held in the grand hall of the palace, a room so vast it could hold thousands of wolves at once. Ilara tried to position herself as far back as possible, hoping to observe from the shadows and then slip away the moment it was permissible, but the crowd was so dense she got pushed forward until she was much closer to the front than she wanted to be. The hall was decorated with elaborate tapestries and banners representing all the major packs, and at the far end was a raised dais with an ornate throne carved from a single piece of black oak. When the Alpha King entered, the entire hall fell silent. He was flanked by his personal guard and advisors, all powerful wolves who radiated dominance, but even among them he stood out. He was tall and broad-shouldered, moving with a predator's grace, and there was something about the way he carried himself that made every wolf in the room instinctively lower their eyes. He wore formal regalia, all black leather and silver threading, and his dark hair was pulled back to reveal a face that was both beautiful and terrifying in its authority. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face because she knew that face. She had spent 8 days staring at it while nursing him back to health in her barn. The wounded stranger she had saved, the man who had promised to come back for her, wasn't some random warrior or even a high-ranking pack member. He was Cale Thornwood, the Alpha King himself, the most powerful werewolf alive, and she had been feeding him vegetable soup and making him sleep in her barn, like he was just some ordinary injured wolf. Her mind reeled trying to make sense of it. Why would the Alpha King have been wounded and alone at the edge of Silvermoon territory? Why hadn't he told her who he was? Why had he let her treat him like an equal when he could have commanded anything from her? The questions spun through her head as she watched him climb the steps to his throne, his expression distant and regal. Nothing like the man who had talked with her in the quiet of the barn. Then Cale sat down, and his eyes swept across the crowd, and the moment his gaze found her, everything else in the room seemed to disappear. She saw recognition flash across his face, saw something that looked like relief and hunger and possessiveness all mixed together, and then she felt it, a pull so strong it nearly drove her to her knees. The bond that had been building between them in those 8 days suddenly slammed into place with the force of destiny, and she knew with absolute certainty what she had suspected but been too afraid to believe. Cale wasn't just the Alpha King. He was her mate, her true mate, the one person in all the world meant specifically for her. The problem was that she was a rejected Omega from a minor pack with no status, no power, and no value in the eyes of werewolf society. And he was the king, required to make a political alliance through his mating that would strengthen his rule and unite the packs. As she stood there feeling the mate bond sing between them, while hundreds of wolves waited to see which powerful alpha female he would choose, Ilara realized that sometimes finding your mate wasn't the happy ending of the story. Sometimes it was just the beginning of an impossible situation with no good solution. Cale stood from his throne, and the crowd fell even more silent, every wolf in the room leaning forward in anticipation. This was it, the moment when he would announce his choice of Luna. Ilara wanted to run, wanted to be anywhere but here, watching him be forced to choose someone else because duty and politics mattered more than something as inconvenient as a mate bond. But she was trapped by the press of bodies around her and could do nothing but watch. The king's voice, when he spoke, carried to every corner of the massive hall with the kind of alpha command that made it impossible not to listen. He spoke of duty and tradition, of the need for strong leadership and unity among the packs. He acknowledged the many fine alpha females who had been presented as potential candidates for Luna, praising their strength and their loyalty to their packs. And then, just when Ilara was Certain he was going to make the politically smart choice and select someone appropriate to his station, he said something that made the entire room erupt in shocked whispers. He said that strength wasn't only measured in dominance or political power. He said that true leadership required compassion as much as authority, kindness as much as fierceness. He said that he had recently learned what it meant to be saved by someone who had every reason to leave him to die, who had risked her own safety, for a stranger with no thought of reward or recognition. And then he looked directly at Alara, his amber eyes burning with intensity, and he said the words that would change everything. He called her by name, Alara of the Silver Moon Pack, and he asked her to come forward. The crowd parted around her like water, every wolf staring at her in shock and confusion, and in some cases outright hostility. She felt like she was moving through a dream as she walked toward the dais, her legs shaking so badly. She was amazed they held her weight. When she reached the steps, Kyle descended from his throne and met her halfway, taking her hand in his in full view of every important wolf in the kingdom. He told the assembled crowd the story of how she had found him wounded and brought him to safety, how she had cared for him with her limited resources and asked for nothing in return. He told them that in those 8 days he had seen more genuine strength and nobility in one rejected Omega than he had seen in years of political maneuvering among the pack elite. And then he declared, in a voice that rang with alpha authority and left no room for argument, that Alara was his true mate, and that he was claiming her as his Luna before the moon goddess and all the packs. The hall erupted into chaos. Wolves shouted in protest, arguing that this was unprecedented, that the king couldn't possibly mate with a reject, that it would weaken his authority and make a mockery of pack hierarchy. The alpha, females who had expected to be chosen, looked murderous, their families outraged at the insult. Alara stood frozen, overwhelmed by the noise and the anger directed at her. But Kale's hand in hers was steady, and when she looked at him, she saw absolute certainty in his eyes. His beta, a grizzled warrior named Marcus who looked like he had survived 100 battles, stepped forward and called for order. The shouting died down enough for Kale to continue speaking, and what he said next showed exactly why he was the Alpha King. He acknowledged the concerns about tradition and hierarchy, but he pointed out that the mate bond was sacred, a gift from the moon goddess herself that no wolf had the right to reject or ignore. He reminded them that he had always put the good of the packs above his own desires, but that in this one thing he would not compromise. More importantly, he turned the political situation on its head by framing Alara not as a weakness, but as a symbol of the change he wanted to bring to werewolf society. He spoke of how the current system created wolves like Alara, individuals with strength and value who were discarded because they didn't fit narrow definitions of worth. He promised that as Luna, she would be his partner in reforming the laws and traditions that allowed packs to abuse and reject their own members. He made it clear that anyone who had a problem with his choice was welcome to challenge him directly, but they had better be prepared to back up their objections with strength, because he would not tolerate disrespect toward his mate. The challenges he expected didn't come, at least not openly, because no wolf in that hall was stupid enough to directly fight the Alpha King. But Alara could see the calculation in many eyes, the plotting and scheming already beginning. She had made powerful enemies before she had even spoken a word, and she knew that being named Luna was not going to be the fairy tale ending, but rather the beginning of a very different kind of struggle. What happened next became a blur of ceremony and ritual. Alara was formally presented to the pack leaders, enduring their barely concealed disdain and false pleasantries. She was marked with Kale's claiming bite in front of the entire assembly, a moment that should have been private and intimate, but was instead a public spectacle. She was dressed in the regalia of the Luna, heavy robes and a crown that felt like it weighed more than she did, and paraded through the capital, so every wolf could see the king's choice. Through it all, Kale stayed close to her, his presence a constant reassurance, even as she felt like she was drowning in expectations and hostility. When they finally had a moment alone that first night, in the royal chambers that were now hers as much as his, she broke down completely. She told him she couldn't do this, that she wasn't strong enough or smart enough or political enough to be Luna, that everyone hated her, and they were right. because what did she know about running a kingdom or being a leader? Kyle let her cry, and then he pulled her close and told her the truth about what had happened to him before she found him. There had been a conspiracy within his own court. High-ranking wolves who thought he was too lenient on the lower ranks and wanted a king who would maintain the traditional power structures more strictly. They had arranged for him to be ambushed during what was supposed to be a routine border inspection. And if Alara hadn't found him, if she hadn't risked everything to save a stranger, he would have died, and the conspirators would have installed a puppet king who suited their purposes. He told her that finding her had shown him how corrupt the system had become, how wolves with true strength of character were being discarded, while those with only physical power and political connections thrived. He admitted that part of why he had claimed her so publicly was strategic, that making her rejected. Omega his Luna sent a message to every pack that the old ways were ending, and that value would be measured differently under his rule. But he swore that the mate bond was real, that what he felt for her went beyond politics, and that he needed her not just as a symbol, but as his partner and equal. Alara wanted to believe him, but 3 years of rejection and abuse had taught her to doubt, especially when things seemed too good to be true. She asked him how long it would be before he resented her for the political damage her position caused, before he started wishing he had chosen someone more suitable. She asked what would happen when she inevitably failed at being Luna, because she had no training and no experience, and everyone was waiting for her to prove she wasn't worthy. His answer was to show her something he had kept hidden even from his closest advisors. He took her to a private library deep in the palace, a room filled with ancient records and documents, and he showed her the truth about her own bloodline. Ilara had always assumed she was just a common Omega, born to unremarkable parents in an unremarkable pack. But the records told a different story. Her mother had been the last surviving member of the Moon Whisper line, an ancient family of Omegas who had once served as mediators and healers to the pack elite before they were systematically eliminated during a political purge 2 generations ago. The Moon Whispers had been killed because they were too powerful in their own way, able to influence emotions and forge connections that threatened the dominance-based hierarchy. Alara's mother had survived only by hiding what she was, mating with a beta in a minor pack and raising her daughter in obscurity. But the abilities hadn't died with the rest of the line. They had just been dormant, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. That was why Alara had been able to save Kale when no one else could, why her presence had soothed his wolf and accelerated his healing. It was why the mate bond between them was so strong, despite their apparent incompatibility of rank. Learning this changed everything and nothing. Alara still didn't know how to be Luna, still felt completely out of her depth, but at least she understood why she was different, why she had never quite fit the mold of what an Omega should be, and it gave her something to hold on to, a heritage of strength that was different from but no less real than the physical dominance prized by traditional pack culture. The first few months of her reign as Luna were exactly as difficult as she had feared. There were constant challenges to her authority, subtle and overt attempts to undermine her. Rumors spread about her inadequacy and speculation about when the king would come to his senses and choose a proper mate. The alpha females who had hoped to be Luna became her worst enemies, using their influence to make her life as difficult as possible while maintaining plausible deniability. But Alara discovered that while she might not have traditional power, she had other tools at her disposal. She remembered what Kale had told her about wanting to reform the system, and she began actually talking to the wolves that the pack elite usually ignored. She visited the Omega quarters in the lower rank territories, listening to stories of abuse and neglect that made her own experience seem mild in comparison. She documented everything, built cases and gathered evidence, and then she brought it to Kale and his council in a way they couldn't ignore or dismiss. If you're invested in seeing how Alara transforms from a rejected Omega into a force for real change, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part of her journey. And drop a comment telling me which pack reform you think should be her top priority. Slowly, painfully, things began to change. Kale issued decrees protecting lower-ranking wolves from arbitrary rejection and abuse, establishing oversight on alpha authority that had previously been absolute. He created a council position for an Omega representative, and when Alara suggested it should be an elected position rather than appointed, he agreed over the howls of protest from traditionalists. Each reform was a battle. Each change fought tooth and nail by those who benefited from the old system. But Alara and Kale kept pushing forward. The real test came 6 months into her reign as Luna, when her old pack, Alpha from Silvermoon, made a formal complaint that she was using her position to undermine pack authority and encourage rebellion among lower ranks. He demanded she be stripped of her title and returned to Silvermoon for discipline, essentially asking the king to reject his own mate. It was a calculated move, designed to force Kale to choose between his mate and his political support from the traditionalist faction. The hearing was held in the same grand hall where Alara had first been claimed as Luna, but this time she wasn't a terrified Omega being thrust into the spotlight. She had spent 6 months learning how to navigate pack politics, how to use her moon whisper abilities to read the emotions in a room and find the leverage points that would shift opinion. She had Kale's support, but she knew this was a challenge she had to meet herself, or she would never truly be accepted as Luna. She faced her old alpha across the hall, this wolf who had rejected her and made her life miserable for years, and she didn't flinch. When he listed his grievances, claiming she was destroying pack hierarchy and encouraging Omegas to forget their place, she didn't try to defend herself against his framing. Instead, she turned to the assembled pack leaders and asked them a simple question. What kind of wolves did they want in their packs? Ones who served out of fear and resentment, or ones who served out of genuine loyalty and respect? She spoke of her own experience, of how rejection and abuse hadn't made her stronger or taught her discipline. It had just made her afraid and small and unable to contribute even a fraction of what she was capable of. She pointed out that the traditionalist system wasted the talents of more than half their population by limiting wolves to narrow roles based on their designation rather than their abilities. She challenged them to look at the reforms that had been implemented and show her where they had actually weakened the packs rather than making them stronger and more unified. Most importantly, she offered them a choice. She said that anyone who truly believed the old ways were better was welcome to maintain them in their own pack, but they would have to accept the consequences when talented wolves like her chose to leave and seek opportunity in packs that valued them. She promised that the royal pack would welcome any wolf, regardless of designation, who could contribute to the strength and prosperity of the whole. It was a gamble, essentially threatening to drain the traditionalist packs of their most capable members if they didn't reform. But she delivered it with enough moon whisper influence that it sounded like a reasonable offer, rather than a threat. The vote, when it came, wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. The majority of pack leaders voted to uphold Kale's reforms and reject the Silvermoon Alpha's complaint. Some voted out of genuine belief in the new system, others because they saw the writing on the wall and wanted to be on the winning side, but the result was the same. Ilara's position as Luna was secure, and the message was clear that challenging her was the same as challenging the king himself. Her old alpha left the capital in disgrace, his own pack members petitioning to join other packs or come to the royal territory. Within a year, Silvermoon had lost half its population, and the alpha was forced to step down in favor of someone more willing to adapt to the changing political climate. It should have felt like victory to Alara, like justice for all the years of mistreatment, but mostly she just felt sad that it had taken so much pain and struggle to reach this point. The real transformation in her relationship with Kale happened gradually over that first year. The mate bond had been instant and undeniable, but trust and partnership took time to build. There were moments when she doubted whether he truly valued her input, or was just humoring her to keep the peace. There were nights when the pressure of being Luna overwhelmed her, and she pulled away from him, unable to believe she deserved any of this. There were fights about how fast to push reforms, about whether political compromise was wisdom or cowardice, about the balance between their public roles and their private relationship. But through it all, the bond held. Cale proved over and over that he meant what he said about partnership, that he genuinely wanted her perspective and valued her insights even when they disagreed. He supported her publicly, even when it cost him political capital, and he gave her the space to grow into her role at her own pace, without rushing her or demanding she be someone she wasn't. And Alara learned to trust, slowly and painfully, that not everyone would abandon her when she became inconvenient, that she was allowed to take up space and have opinions and make mistakes without being rejected. By the end of that first year, they had established a rhythm that worked. Mornings were for official duties, councils and hearings, and the endless bureaucracy of running a kingdom. Afternoons, Alara spent visiting different territories and working with the Omega Council that had become her special project. Evenings were theirs alone, a sacred time when they could set aside their crowns and just be Cale and Alara, mates and partners, figuring out how to build a life together. It was during one of those quiet evenings that Alara realized she was pregnant. She had been feeling off for weeks, tired and emotional in ways that didn't match her usual patterns, but she had attributed it to stress. When the pack healer confirmed what her wolf already knew, Alara felt a mix of joy and terror that left her breathless. A child, an heir to the throne, a tiny life that would be scrutinized and judged from the moment of birth. A baby who would carry both the ancient power of the Moonwhisper line and the dominance of the Alpha King, a combination that had never existed before, and that no one could predict. She told Cale that night, and she would never forget the look on his face, the way his eyes went soft, and his hand trembled when he placed it on her still flat stomach. He had admitted to her once that he had never expected to have a family, that he had assumed his life would be nothing but duty and politics and the loneliness of power. Finding her had changed everything, and now they were creating something entirely new, a future neither of them had dared to imagine. The pregnancy changed the political landscape in ways Alara hadn't anticipated. Some of the traditionalist opposition softened, unable to maintain hostility toward a Luna who was carrying the next generation of the royal line. Others doubled down, spreading rumors that the child would be weak or unstable because of Alara's Omega blood, trying to plant seeds of doubt about the succession before the baby was even born. Alara learned to ignore most of it, focusing instead on taking care of herself and preparing for the enormous responsibility of raising a child who would one day rule all the packs. Labor, when it came 8 months later, was attended by every high-ranking wolf in the capital, all of them claiming they needed to verify the legitimacy of the heir. Alara endured their presence with as much grace as she could manage while experiencing the most intense pain of her life. Cale stayed with her through all of it, ignoring protocol that said the king should wait. Elsewhere, his hand in hers, and his presence, the only thing that kept her grounded. Their daughter was born just after midnight, arriving with a strong cry that echoed through the palace. She was perfect, with dark hair like her father, and eyes that shifted between amber and hazel depending on the light. The pack healer who examined her declared her healthy and strong, and more importantly, declared that she bore the marks of both alpha dominance and moon whisper gifts, a unique combination that made her potentially the most powerful wolf of her generation. They named her Lyra, after Cale's mother who had died when he was young, and Alara held her and felt a fierce protectiveness that she had never experienced before. This child would not grow up rejected and discarded like her mother had. This child would know from her first breath that she was valued and loved and powerful in her own right. This child would inherit a kingdom that was changing, slowly but surely, into something better than what had come before. The years that followed brought more changes and more challenges. There were attempts to undermine Alara's reforms, pacts that tried to maintain the old ways in defiance of the new laws. There were threats against Lyra from wolves who saw her mixed heritage as an abomination rather than a gift. There were political marriages to arrange, treaties to negotiate, and endless councils where Alara had to prove over and over that she deserved her position as Luna. But there were also victories. More and more packs began electing Omega representatives to their councils. The rejection rate dropped dramatically as alphas realized they couldn't just discard wolves who didn't meet their narrow standards. Young wolves started choosing mates based on the mate bond rather than political advantage, inspired by the king and Luna's example. The moon whisper abilities that had been suppressed for generations began to re-emerge in Omega wolves across the kingdom, and instead of being feared, they were valued for the unique strengths they brought. Alara never forgot where she had come from, never let herself become so comfortable in her position that she lost touch with the wolves who were still struggling. She made a point of visiting the territories where rejected wolves lived, listening to their stories and making sure they knew that change was possible. She established schools where wolves of all designations could learn skills that interested them, rather than being limited to traditional roles. She created a fund that helped rejected wolves relocate to packs that would value them, and she celebrated every time she heard about an Omega rising to a position of real authority. On their 5th anniversary of mating, Kale took Alara back to her old cottage at the edge of Silvermoon territory. The pack that had rejected her no longer existed in its old form, having been absorbed into a neighboring pack with more progressive leadership. But the cottage was still there, weathered and empty. They stood in the barn where she had first saved him, and Kale thanked her again for having the courage to help a stranger when she had every reason to protect only herself. Alara looked around at the place that had been her prison and her refuge, and she realized she didn't feel bitter anymore. Everything she had experienced, all the pain and rejection and loneliness, had shaped her into someone capable of making real change. If she had been accepted and valued by Silvermoon, she might never have developed the compassion that made her reach out to Kale. She might never have understood what needed to change, because she would have been comfortable within the system rather than crushed by it. She told him that she wouldn't change anything, not the rejection or the isolation, or even the fear and uncertainty of that first year as Luna, because all of it had brought her here, to this moment, with him and their daughter, and a kingdom that was slowly becoming the kind of place where wolves like her young self could thrive instead of just survive. He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and told her that she was the strongest wolf he had ever known, not despite being Omega but because of it, because she had turned gentleness into power and compassion into revolution. As they left the cottage and headed back to Thornwood, back to their responsibilities and their daughter, and the work that was never truly finished, Alara thought about the girl she had been 5 years ago. That girl would never have believed this was possible, would never have imagined that the wounded stranger she saved could be her mate, her partner, the father of her child. That girl had been so certain she was worthless, so convinced that rejection defined her value. But that girl had also been wrong about a lot of things. She had possessed a strength she didn't recognize, a capacity for love and courage that had changed the course of history. She had saved a king not with dominance or power, but with simple kindness, and in doing so, she had saved herself and countless others who would benefit from the changes her actions set in motion. The story of the rejected Omega who became Luna was already passing into legend, told in packs across the kingdom as an example of how one wolf's choice could change everything. But Alara knew the real story was more complicated and more beautiful than the legend. It wasn't about a weak wolf being rescued by a powerful mate. It was about 2 wolves finding each other exactly when they needed to, and having the courage to choose love and partnership over the easier path of maintaining the status quo. Years later, when Lyra was old enough to ask questions, she would want to know how her parents met and fell in love. Alara would tell her the truth, that it started with a storm and a wounded stranger, and a choice to help when it would have been safer to look away. She would tell her that love wasn't always instant or easy, that sometimes it required fighting for each other, and for the right to be together against a world that didn't understand. She would tell her that being Luna wasn't about being perfect or powerful in traditional ways. It was about using whatever strengths you had to make things better for those who came after. And she would tell her daughter that the greatest magic in all of werewolf lore wasn't the transformation or the mate bond, or even the ancient moon whisper gifts. The greatest magic was the ability to see value where others saw weakness, to choose compassion when cruelty would be easier, to believe in the possibility of change even when everyone said it was impossible. That was the magic that had transformed a rejected Omega into a Luna, a wounded king into a partner, and a kingdom into something better than it had been. As Alara stood in the nursery watching Lyra sleep, Kale's arms wrapped around her from behind and his chin resting on her shoulder, she knew that the story wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more wolves who resisted change, more moments when she doubted herself and wondered if she was strong enough for this role. But she also knew that she wasn't facing any of it alone, that the mate bond that had seemed like an impossible gift was actually the foundation of everything they were building together. The wounded stranger she had saved in her barn had become her partner, her love, and her fellow revolutionary. Together they were creating a legacy that would outlast them both, a kingdom where wolves like Lyra would grow up knowing they had value regardless of their designation, where kindness was strength and compassion was power, where the old hierarchies were giving way to something better and more just. And it had all started with a storm, a choice, and one Omega who had been brave enough to trust her own heart, even when the world told her she was worthless. Sometimes, Ilara reflected, the greatest revolutions began not with violence or grand gestures, but with simple acts of kindness offered to strangers in need. Sometimes saving one life could save a kingdom. Sometimes the weakest wolf in the pack turned out to be the strongest after all. The end. Thank you so much for joining me on Ilara and Kale's journey, from that stormy night in the barn to the transformation of an entire kingdom. If you loved this story of how compassion and courage can change the world, please give it a like and share it with friends who enjoy supernatural romance with depth and meaning. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that explore the power of unexpected connections and the courage it takes to challenge unjust systems. Drop a comment and let me know what part of Ilara's transformation resonated most with you and what kind of supernatural romance you'd like to see next. Until next time, remember that sometimes the greatest strength is found in the gentlest hearts.